Hi, everybody. Super happy to be here at my third MacDevOps. Thank you. My name is Katie English, and I work on the product team at Jamf. And last year, I stood on this stage and pointed out that a lot of you as admins are outliers. I might have used the word snowflakes. Maybe you've been in this business a while like I have, and since before MDM was ever even a thing. Maybe you've inherited an admin environment that's heavily scripted, and you've come to appreciate the amount of visibility and control that you have with that kind of implementation. Or maybe you've had poor experiences with MDM and you just feel like you can't trust it. And I want to say I totally get it. I spent a long time as an admin in a scripted space, making local agents jump through increasingly complex hoops to make Macs behave the way I needed. And when those scripts or scripted actions failed, I knew exactly who was to blame. And it wasn't some amorphous cloud service in a data center far away. And in contrast, MDM can feel very much like a black box. It feels like you click a button in a console and that amorphous cloud service not in your data center does a thing. And if you're lucky, you get the expected result on your managed Mac. When you don't get that expected result, that black box gets really, really frustrating. In previous talks, I've spoken about Apple's clear indication that OS changes will increasingly limit programmatic access to local binaries in favor of invoking actions by way of management command or user initiation instead. We've seen this happen already with the software update binary, everybody's favorite, and even disabling the reprovisioning trick of deleting the Apple setup done file. If you want to reprovision a Sonoma Mac, you got to issue a proper device wipe command, or you have to be a real human in front of the Mac with usable credentials. More and more administrative tasks are going to require administrative tooling. As of just last week with the new macOS betas, we're seeing more and more management and security functionality coming by way of declarations, like service and background task management. And while we can simulate a lot of that functionality with scripts and commands, you're not likely to get the same degree of administrative enforcement or the same flavor of native end-user notification. So I'm not saying that everybody needs to let expired MDM commands be bygones, but I am saying that we can use evidence of MDM actions on local clients to bolster our understanding of the protocol and increase our confidence that it's going to do the right thing when we need it to. So that's why I'm here, to shine a light into some dark corners of your Mac file system and give you some stuff to try at home. We'll start with ensuring that your Mac is properly managed. Then we'll wander down memory lane with MCX. We'll talk about MDM client and the wealth of information you can discover in the local log stream. We'll talk about software updates, which gets a yearly facelift. And then we'll wrap up by using MDM to run some scripts. I'm going to start with some of the basics, which is explicit, observable evidence that your Mac is properly managed. A lot of this assumes that you have local admin access, but of course you do because you're the admins. So previously you might have used the profiles binary to list out profiles or try and force a device into an enrollment cycle with profiles or new type enrollment. Starting with macOS Sonoma, you're going to see that automated device enrollment is quite a bit more resilient and insistent, and in fact might surprise you like it did this user on Reddit, who says, I purchased a Mac Mini off Marketplace last year that appeared to be clean, and I was able to put my iCloud account on it. But as soon as I installed macOS Sonoma, it had MDM. This was October of last year. If somehow a Mac in AXM slips past the enrollment process during Setup Assistant or the process is manually triggered by a script, Sonoma is going to enforce device management via a full screen workflow that allows an 8-hour deferral once, then forces the end user to enroll or wipe the device. The Sonoma upgrade basically puts the automated device enrollment experience on rails, and you saw Kevin describe this in great detail yesterday as a means of migrating MDMs, which was super clever. And that means technically, if you have the MDM enrollment profile and maybe even some other profiles or declarations present on the device, you're probably good to go as far as management goes. But if you're at all skeptical, there are some other things to check into. And these are conditions on the device whose absence may indicate a problem with the application of management in your environment, with a notable exception to be made for shared Macs in the lab. I'll get to that. And the first detectable condition is about supervision. A supervised device specifically means that it's enrolled in an MDM solution that has been granted an extra amount of management purview because the device is organizationally owned. This has gotten a little interesting. There's some nuance here with recent account-driven enrollments, but to be pretty basic about it, if it's an organizationally owned Mac, you want it to be supervised. So that enables the maximum amount of MDM control. The bootstrap token is another specific artifact of modern management. It allows for the propagation of secure tokens, which of course allow a given user to decrypt the file vault encrypted drive at the login window. And this is one of those notable exceptions that I mentioned a couple minutes ago for shared Macs, because it's likely you're not doing encryption for lab-based devices, for example. On a Mac with Apple Silicon, the bootstrap token can also allow MDM authorization to install kernel extensions and software updates, as well as authorize a remote erase all content and settings command. More on that one in a little bit. And next up is volume ownership, which I specifically add here because it can be confusing. And under conditions, it could be possible to get into a state where the local user doesn't actually have full rights to do the things that you might expect. So Rich Troughton had a recent article on his Dear Flounder blog titled Volume Ownership and Erase All Content and Settings on macOS Sonoma. I'll have a link at the end of the session in case you want to take a look at it. Pretty useful, worth reading. Basically, the conclusion is that volume ownership and its downstream impacts aren't strictly about MDM per se, but users created by MDM on the Mac may inadvertently get into a state where they don't have volume ownership, so it could be worth spot checking your accounts. And I'm starting with the basics for a reason. If you're skeptical about the efficacy of MDM, the first thing to know is whether management is appropriately applied to your Mac. Technically, your Mac is managed with MDM if it has a valid enrollment profile applied. We saw Zach talk about that yesterday. You could get away with simply checking that one thing. However, fully featured management generally implies other local conditions, and if those conditions start to drift from baseline, you might see some strange outcomes in your environment. Notably, all of these conditions are observable and measurable, and it turns out the rest of MDM is pretty much also observable and measurable in similar ways on a Mac. So, with that baseline in mind, we've established that MDM is properly applied to your managed Mac, props, and we know that MDM is about a series of commands and queries. The black box is really just about the mechanism by which those commands and queries are delivered to the Mac. I'll revisit this later, but I'm going to preface it by emphasizing Apple services are not brokering your private Wi-Fi credentials, right? They're just telling the device that their management server needs to get them to check in to receive one of those commands or respond to one of those queries. So if that means if stuff isn't working quite right, the black box there probably isn't at fault. Let's start with settings. This might trigger some nostalgia for some of you. Settings, like Zach mentioned yesterday, are just a flavor of command. But more specifically, I'm going to be talking about managed preferences as delivered by config profiles. Because as an admin back in OS X server days, decoding MCX to make computers behave the exactly way I wanted was a source of profound nerd satisfaction. Still kind of miss that, actually. We called it the magic triangle or the golden triangle, some kind of superlative triangle. You'd get direction information for user authentication from Active Directory. You'd get the local environment settings and authorization from OS X server. The client would put those things together, compose them at the time of login, smush them, and now your network credentials translate to a local login that behaves how it's supposed to. And honestly, this, like I said, triggers a lot of nostalgia. But what I really love about this is it hasn't actually gone anywhere. MCX is still fundamentally present on the Mac operating system. The plist files still live in library managed preferences. The old binaries are still there, though I couldn't make MCX refresh actually do anything. And the client is still reading the same preference domains and key values, then compositing them on the file system to apply to the system or user level. And because it's still there, and because it's still fundamentally property lists that are still human readable, you can rely on defaults read to validate that the settings have been applied. Or maybe they haven't for all users for some reason, but you can interrogate the local user directories to see them. You can even work backwards if for some reason you really need to, like exactly how we used to do back in MCX days. So you've got a particular app with a particular setting that you want applied at launch. Maybe you don't want your users to be bothered with a welcome window. Can't read that from out there, I'm sure, but it's a super common workflow. So I'll blow that up a little bit. You do the settings management ritual dance. You launch the app on your development device. You set the setting the way you want. You go find the resulting change buried somewhere in the local user directory. And when you have a plist that describes the preference domain and the local key pair setting, your plist might have some stray stuff in it that you end up slicing it out, so you trim it down to the essentials. You use defaults right or plist buddy. You write out the values, this key, this value, the preference domain in reverse DNS format. You want to distribute that setting to the user directories of your managed devices, and there are a bunch of different ways to do that. You can get it to the user template, drop it in managed preferences for the system to detect and compose into other settings. You could do a clumsy recursive local script that writes the local file into the user directories. But if you copy the key and the value into a profile and distribute it by way of MDM, you can see the exact same file contents in the exact same preference domain, and you've just replaced the magic triangle with the MDM black box. The OS doesn't care how that file got there. It just knows to do the job with it once it arrives. So remember that MDM works on push notifications. Your managed client down at the bottom has a persistent outbound connection to Apple services. And when your MDM server, top right, asks those services to get a device to phone home, Apple basically yanks on the string and says, hey, check in with your management server. And when the device does, the management server responds with whatever's new that you want applied. MCX back in the day required an OS event like a login or a restart to go and fetch those new settings. Or sometimes you had to muck around with MCX refresh or maybe even Discal to actually delete the local caches and restart. The MDM version of this process happens quite a bit faster and more reliably, but the outcomes are basically identical. So, lesson number 1 in demystifying MDM as it applies to a Mac, when you're applying local client or user settings, you can see them. You can go to Library Managed Preferences and look through the text files there to see what settings are applied either at the system level or go one level deeper into a user directory and see the settings there. Even the fully composed version at the username /complete.plist. You can use all the usual tools like defaults or plist buddy to parse those files and ensure that the settings you want are effectively applied. And just to be really precise, not every setting lands in Library Managed Preferences. Some end up in Library Preferences, like the second example here, Managed Wi-Fi Networks, which end up represented in the Library Preferences COM Apple Wi-Fi known-networks.plist, but ultimately, it's still a text file that can be examined locally. Settings applied by the black box end up looking just like settings applied by any other method, including the ancient methods of triangles of yore. You might not trust it yet, but you can verify, and eventually you'll end up with a lot higher confidence that the OS is doing what you expect. Which leads to conclusion number 1, MDM is inspectable on macOS. Of course, it's not just the file system artifacts in particular directories or the profiles visible in system settings. There are other tools to see the effects of MDM on a managed Mac. If you haven't already played with the MDM client library, you absolutely should carefully. You can use it to simulate outputs of MDM commands, and it's really pretty cool. It's also important to point out that there's a big old warning on the binaries man page that says, do not rely on any output this command may produce. So you might be thinking, well, this is just a black box by another name. And that's pretty fair. I would not expect to use the MDM client binary to replace certificate list or the installed application list from MDM. The documentation you'll find online is pretty sparse, which I think is by design. And in some cases, it's actually pretty outdated. You might remember this prompt from days of yore, but if you try it now, it's actually going to tell you to do the aforementioned profiles renew type enrollment instead. So we're going to take the man page at its word, don't rely on it. And ultimately, you might not benefit from interacting directly with MDM client, but rather by using its local artifacts for troubleshooting. So, for example, you send a legacy imperative MDM software update command. You're examining the client trying to figure out, what is it doing right now? Especially if it's not updating like you might be expecting. And you can stream those events filtered by MDM statuses as recorded by the MDM client binary, and that will yield a lot of information. Hopefully some of it's actually useful to you. If we stick with the example of that legacy imperative MDM software update, you can use predicates to find log messages for the process and the status, like deferral, or events like download is complete, or install did finish. You can also filter by a time period, like the bit at the last part there, last hour, last day. Tons of information in the local log. And if you're so inclined, you could build a launch daemon to periodically watch for certain events and trigger additional downstream processes. But how else could we use MDM client log streaming? Well, I got a really interesting question from a customer a couple months back. Can you certify that a device was wiped once the erase device command is issued? And that's a really interesting problem to solve. The device wipe command is actually deceptively complex. There's a lot going on here. Not only does it define data obliteration behavior that varies based on chip architecture, but it can also define the device recovery condition by way of return to service, which leads to a sort of existential question, what exactly does it mean to be wiped? So as usual in my job, I need to ask why a few times. Why does this customer care so much about wiping a device? And it turns out they're a financial services company. So on the scale of 0 to control freak, they're definitely trending toward, I need a log of every event in the history of everything ever. So when they send a remote wipe command, they need to be incredibly confident that it actually completed. So I leaned on a particularly smart coworker. Some of you may be familiar with him. His name is Mark Buffington. We refer to him as Encyclopedia Bufftanica. And he helped me understand some of the options here. The local MDM client does process erase assistant commands when they're received, just like I described with the software update command. So you could build a little local watcher to filter out some of those events in the log and have an agent do some sort of notification workflow. But the problem in this scenario is that you're fundamentally in a erase condition. The moment MDM issues that erase device command, local to client time is really, really limited. If you're depending on local client logic to provide evidence of command success, it's extremely likely that the client will just stop responding and cease all local processes before it can even report back. So we can't reliably certify the success of this particular command from the client itself. But let's remember that the MDM command, what it actually does, and what an example response back to the server might be. So, despite recent headlines about deleted files suddenly becoming undeleted after an OS update, what a wipe or erase all content and settings command does is actually destroy the encryption key for the local data volume. And we're not overwriting every sector with ones and zeros, but once the key is deleted, that data is fundamentally inaccessible. And that's partly why an erase device command is so fast. The path of APNS communication for a command like this is identical to what we previously described for a setting. Admin issues the command, management server hits APNS, APNS tells the managed client to phone home, and once it does, it finds out what it's supposed to do next. In the case of an erase device command, there might be some extra instructions in regard to how the device should handle the command, and whether there are network limitations depending on the chip architecture. Try some pre-flight checks before acknowledging the command and responding back to the server. The server ultimately sees something like this with the command acknowledged, and the time between the command being sent and completion is somewhere around a second, depending on how fast your network is. What's fun about this, depending on your management server, you can apply a very similar log filtering logic to the server's version of commands as you can locally on the client with log streaming out of the MDM client binary. The outcome here is really more about trust but verify than it is trust and certified. But the point is that MDM is actually pretty verbose, both on the local client side and on the server logging side, maybe more than you might realize. Okay, software updates, got to brace myself. I love software updates, I do. I've already suggested that you can use local log streaming predicates to search for MDM commands in the local client to see what the status of software update command processes are. But that makes a pretty big assumption that you're using MDM commands for software updates at all, and that you're not relying on any number of open source tools or agents or other prompts trying to push the end user to comply with whatever your patch policy is. Maybe you're still sad that the kickstart command has been deprecated. Sorry about that. These tools and the resulting verbose blog posts exist for a really, really valid reason. Because we've relied on scripted outcomes for a really long time. And despite Apple pushing admins away from programmatic workflows for administrative tasks, we still got work to get done, right? So what we're ultimately demonstrating with these tools is that smart people will go to significant effort to avoid MDM software updates on the Mac, which is a bummer. But all that being said, at last year's WWDC, we learned about new declarative options that became available in macOS Sonoma and iOS 17. And in case you haven't seen this in action, what we're talking about is a declaration or a statement of instructions that tells the client how to behave. So in the case of a declarative software update, the admin defines the date and time that the update will be enforced and the version that the update will install. This is how it looks in Jamf. I'm sure it looks pretty similar in other tools. The client then uses local native logic to communicate with the end user to actually pop up escalating notifications about the impending update, giving the user the option to hit install on their own time rather than waiting until the last minute. And when the deadline comes, the client self-enforces the update. If the client is powered off during that time, it catches up with the enforced update within an hour of the subsequent startup. So instead of using a local agent to try and talk the end user into behaving, or using traditional verbose immediate gratification or failure MDM commands, you can basically schedule updates at your leisure, and the client handles the conditions of success for you. It just works, no step 3. You're not probably inclined to trust. I've actually, literally this week, saw a pretty heated conversation on LinkedIn about people not trusting this process. So we need to verify. Okay. Just like the remaining evidence of MCX, just like the log stream that dumps out local MDM client activity, you can actually see evidence of a scheduled declaration on your local Mac. So once you've sent an update declaration, you'll want to look at a file called software update DDM state persistence. That's a plist in VARDB software update. It's mostly human readable. You'll be able to see the target OS version and the scheduled date and time that it will be applied. Not only that, you can work backwards to anticipate what an end user will be seeing leading up to that scheduled event. Maybe you could even go so far as to queue your help desk to respond to calls about the notifications that they're starting to see. Thanks to Ross Matsuda at sudoade.com, there's a quick one-liner to retrieve the due date. And if you were keen to add that to your existing user notification workflows, that would be super easy. And speaking of user notification workflows, and armed with that data that we harvested from the local declarative artifact, we can take a tool like Kevin White's Superman, which is a very robust collection of tools. That's a great example of the ways that smart people have been trying to work through the poor end user experience of software updates. This workflow uses notifications via IBM's notifier tool to pop up dialogues about deadlines. And technically, you should be getting roughly equivalent notifications via local client logic in the notification center on an escalating basis. But there's definitely an argument to be made about over-communicating with an end user, maybe even using this as a way to transition from the older style script-based notifications to declarative ones. You can use both for a while. And just because this is an amazing community, Kevin is already thinking of ways to augment his super project with the declarative persistence values. So keep an eye on that project. I'm sure there'll be some cool release notes soon. Okay. All of this combined means we can use a declarative action like enforce software updates and a robust scripted workflow that you're already successful with. You can trust and verify. And now we have all kinds of options for communicating with your end users, either natively via Notification Center or using the open source tool sets that you're already deploying. One last thing. Given the brains in this room and the kind of work that you all need to get done, you probably still have to script a significant portion of your day. MDM doesn't solve all your problems. So depending on your tool set, you may already have some fairly robust local agents with elevated access privileges to run scripts on demand, or maybe you use a remote access tool, SSH, whatever. But if you haven't already tried it, make sure you take a look at SAP's Script PKG, which is a really nice utility to help you make payloadless packages that can contain a script. This basically gets you to the best of both worlds, the control of a script, the option to deploy that script by MDM, using whatever mechanism is at your disposal that triggers the install application or install enterprise application command. In a Jamf-specific context, you might use this method to package up a script that fires during pre-stage enrollment so that your Mac leaves the setup assistant with apps or configurations that you need. And if you're specifically opting to install a script during the setup assistant, it needs to be delivered by a means that's signed and accompanied by a package manifest. So let me unpack that for a second, because using a tool to package a script and signing the package, that's kind of a lot. So why even bother? What's the benefit? Well, if we're using install enterprise application via MDM, you get some significant extra assurance that the contents of the package or script haven't been tampered with. It's not nearly as convenient as dropping a shell script over and running it by SSH, but it does allow for scripts to be run in contexts that are otherwise fairly inaccessible, specifically like a guided onboarding experience. And just like augmenting Superman or your scripted software update method with awareness of a pending declarative action, you can mix and match your workflows. Basically, you can take advantage of the good parts of MDM with the speed of push notifications and the high threshold for security and elevated privileges, and you can still get the granular scripted control that you're looking for. So, kind of summing all this up, you may still feel like MDM behaves unpredictably or does stuff on the client that doesn't stand up to inspection. You might still distrust the black box, but you, the smart admin human, can see artifacts of MDM on the client, even declarative artifacts. You can use common tools to verify the delivery of settings and commands and report on that later. The MDM client binary goes so far as to allow you to simulate some local outputs to further assure you of your management outcomes. And none of that means that MDM is infallible. But if you're using these tools, you can both inform your MDM vendor and Apple of ways to improve the overall experience. Apple is open to feedback, and if you can explain or log what you're doing and how it does or doesn't work, that will only help them improve the protocol for everybody else, including your friendly MDM developer. So if you're still feeling a little wary, that's okay. I hope you can use these tools to get more confidence and help make MDM better. So thank you, and here are the combined resources in case you want to take a picture of that. Thank you.